Callie had wanted to be a photographer her whole life. Before she could even walk, she'd snapped her first picture. Sure, she'd done so on accident. Her dad had left a camera on the couch, and a little kid can't resist pushing buttons. But still, Callie's the only person I've ever known who's taken one of the pictures in her own baby album. A great big close-up of her face, level with the couch, smiling and covered in chocolate. Her dad told me it had come from a melted Kit Kat bar. I still keep that picture in my wallet. Before I'd spoken with my parents, the hospital had been censoring my television viewing, so as not to upset me, they explained. But once my parents had mentioned the specter of war looming, everyone spoke plainly. The way the government doctors put it, the Australarctic War had begun like this. At first, Australia had tried to go it alone. After all, they reasoned, they had the most legitimate claim to Antarctica, what with the recent discovery of the Wilkes Land crater. If you believed in that theory, then Antarctica had been part of Australia some 100 million years ago. And hey, the world has recognized much more tenuous claims to land than that. But then Australia did some more reasoning. They reasoned that they were a nation with greater landmass than the continental United States, but with fewer people than the state of New York. Population-wise, Australia didn't even make it into the world's top 50 countries. In terms of natural resources, aside from 40% of the world's uranium ore, which, in light of the Great Discovery, had just become a bit, shall we say, obsolete. All they had was lots of coral and rocks and sand and dirt. Didn't have the St. Lawrence Seaway or the Great Lakes or the Mississippi River to facilitate transportation, which was how the US and most other top countries had grown up. No, the entire center of the Australian continent was nothing but desert, and even that wasn't the biggest or the best in the world. All combined, the Central Australian Desert came in fourth, behind the Arabian, third, and the Sahara, second. The biggest, of course, being Antarctica. So Australia had reasoned that they better enlist some outside help, and to do so, they founded the Seven Nations, a coalition of willing, well-armed, well-populated countries, in aggregate anyways, whose goal was to oppose Antarctica's annexation by the United States. Their main argument? The United States stood to gain an insurmountable military advantage through the monopoly of Zanadium and Zanadium-based weaponry. The U.S. government, of course, dismissed this argument, calling it against the best interest of Earth's global community. But nevertheless, it was in the best long-term interests of Earth's global community that the Seven Nations justified a preemptive war. It may seem rather silly now, here at the end, but back then it was all very important to me. Not because I believed or disbelieved in the Seven Nations' premise for going to war, but because I knew Callie. Callie's favorite photos, however beautiful, were never pretty. And ever since her very first photo, her own smiling face full of Kit Kat chocolate, there was nothing Callie loved photographing more than disaster. If war broke out in Australia, I knew she'd head straight for the conflict. When I hung up the phone after that first call home, I just lay there, staring at my distorted reflection in the plastic bubble surrounding my bed. I grabbed my Congressional Medal of Honor. The thing about the Congressional Medal of Honor is that no two pressings are alike. I don't mean because of defects. It's not like how trendy clothes stores try to pass off shoddy workmanship as each item is unique, call it couture, and then sell it for like 600 times the cost. No, the U.S. Mint pressed each Congressional Medal of Honor with an image designed to represent the specific event for which Congress issued the medal. For instance, the Navajo Codebreaker Medal shows Native Americans huddled around a telephone, breaking codes for the war effort. Winston Churchill's probably also shows something to do with World War II, as should FDR's. I have no idea what John Wayne's looks like, or why he got one. Rayner's and my Congressional Medal of Honor showed two men, both their hands around the hilt of a large glowing sword jammed in the top of an upside-down earth. The two men, who looked like Rayner and me, were about to wrench the sword free in an action reminiscent of the legend of King Arthur. The part of the sword sticking out of the earth had the following words engraved on it: "Salvation comes from within," which was reminiscent of the president's speech. Why was the sword glowing? Robert asks me. Oh, I don't know. I always interpreted that to mean that the sword was like radioactive or like it was supposed to be made of zanadium. But radioactive materials do not glow, Robert says, except underwater, and then only in very specific circumstances. Yeah, I say, not really paying attention to him. I've just switched the computerized window from outer space to the small inner chamber at the rear of the ship. When a charged particle accelerates underwater, Robert explains, it may emit a bluish glow as it surpasses the speed of light. I scroll my mechanical finger towards the zoom control, controlling the direction of the zoom with my human hand. As I had suspected, my passenger, or prisoner, depending upon your opinion of her condition, is still sleeping soundly, dead to the world. Wait, I say, turning my attention back to Robert. Did you say something about faster than the speed of light? Nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. Yes, Clay Ingram, but that is only true in a vacuum. Water reduces the speed of light by 25%, allowing an electron to catch up to the very same light it reflects. Some think of this as the visual equivalent of a sonic boom. The human eye interprets this phenomena as a bluish glow. Oh, all right. So, how does your eye interpret it? I know the phenomenon as Cherenkov radiation. If I prefer, I can see it the same way as you, but I would have to limit my senses to one at a time. I say, nodding. Does that mean I could have put my amputated arm in a fishbowl and made a blue tinted light bulb or something? No, Robert says. No? Not even enough to read my Congressional Medal of Honor by? She is in perfect physical health, Robert tells me. I can monitor her vital signs. If you turn back now, she might... Her vital signs? No. Despite what you might think, Clay Ingram. I shake my head, watching her lie curled in the fetal position up on the computerized screen. Perhaps decades. Decades, huh? Wow, that's horrible. Why do you want her to die? Me? I don't. You have set course for Grover. Yes, because I want her to live, I say. I shrug. I don't know what to tell you, Robert. I suppose that's a phenomenon I know is love. Can you understand that? With all your advanced sensing mechanisms and so forth? Can you limit your senses enough to interpret love? Love? Robert asks. And then after a long pause, no, Clay Ingram. I would have to expand my senses to encompass love. It is beyond my current capabilities. I don't believe that, I say. You were saying about your Congressional Medal of Honor? Robert asks. I stare at the black mesh speaker a second, take one more glance at the screen, switch the screen back to outer space. Yes, that, I say. I used to stare at that stupid medal all the time. The last thing I needed was another distraction. I needed a plan, almost as much as I needed a drink. So I put the medal down and slid it under the sheets. Then I got to thinking. First things first, get an arm. Callie had always liked that arm, the one I'd lost. That arm, man, that was the arm Callie had held at prom, and the arm I'd used to escort her down the aisle at her cousin's wedding. I'd used that arm to slide my hand underneath her shirt for the first time, to fumble with her bra for the 3 longest minutes of my adolescent life. It was the arm I'd used to shove her out from in front of a robot-driven school bus, almost killing myself in the process, when we were maybe 12 or 13 years old. That was the moment that sparked our first romantic eye contact. Something about impending mortality, I guess. In any case, that was going to be a hard arm to replace. Thank God for robots, and buses driven by robots. It used to be that medical technology's greatest advancements came during wars. On the battlefield, doctors could perform a lifetime's worth of surgeries in just a few weeks. With bullets whizzing past and the enemy closing in, wartime doctors were forced to experiment with radical techniques that often led to astonishing insights. Not to mention that there were no malpractice suits. Throughout history, the countries with the best medical establishments have always been the same countries that sent the most boys to die abroad. But the greatest advancements, medical or otherwise, in the history of the world, those came about when the world found itself at war with its most formidable enemy, an unthinking, unfeeling monster named Grover. The government's robotics division had been working on humanoid robots long before they'd learned of Grover, but Grover had increased their budget substantially. The initial plan had had one minor personnel problem. The era's best spacecraft couldn't carry enough food for living astronauts, not deep enough into space to rendezvous with Grover and blow it up at a safe distance. Near-Earth detonation could turn what had been a bullet into a shotgun blast. And so, since it seemed that robots would have to complete the Grover Seek and Destroy mission, funding for the robotics division had shot through the roof. Soon, however, the astronomy division pointed out that Dr. Maximus Grover's calculations predicted Grover's orbit to be of the corkscrewing variety. This meant Grover would approach within a few thousand miles of Earth's atmosphere and sail past, 39 years before it would circle back around and collide, what became known as the first pass trajectory. The first pass meant that astronauts, human astronauts, could land, drill, and then wait until Grover was heading away from Earth to detonate. No need for robots. Later, of course, the government would call upon robots to do this work anyways, but this was only after decades of public protests. Robots would land on Grover during the first pass, even though dead human astronauts were more cost-effective. After the astronomy division's heads up, the robotics division saw its funding pared back, but not before they'd patented hundreds of offshoot technologies, the most lucrative and, to me, important of which were artificial limbs. Robotic arms and legs that could communicate with a nervous system even more complicated than ours. In fact, when the government doctors had finished the 18-hour operation to equip me with the robotic arm, one of them claimed the designers had to modify the arm's processing unit to accept impulses firing at such slow speeds. He meant slow speeds firing from my slow brain. Really, I said. So, can this thing open imported beers? I mean, if they're not twist-offs? And guess what? It could. With my new, mostly human-looking arm intact, I threw my bottle openers away and started asking when I could leave the government hospital. They made me take physical therapy first, but I didn't need much. Those ghost pains, or rather that feeling like my arm was still there, came in handy. I'd lost an arm, but not the proprioception of that arm. And so picking up a beer with my artificial arm felt pretty much like picking up a beer with my normal arm, except that I couldn't feel the bottle. But then again, the way I drank, it's not like I felt the bottle much anyways. And I had stopped drinking, for the time being. Anyways, when my physical therapist recommended my transfer home, the first thing I probably should have done was to call my parents and give them the good news and plan a homecoming party at Keenan's or something with all my friends from Tinsel Park, even though, to their minds, I'd already had a parade. But instead, I went down to the government hospital's internet lab and started looking for flights. By this time, almost a year since that first phone call home to my parents, the war was already in full swing, and this presented a problem. There were no flights from America to Australia, not a single one, not unless you were in the military. Which confused me, because these kind of things are complicated. I mean, at first, I thought I just could have stayed put because the conflict was coming to me, right? All the fighting was about to take place in Antarctica. It's not like the U.S. was going to bomb Australia or any of the other 7 nations. That would have opened the door to attacks on the American mainland. And that was all true. Hell, the Australians had kicked out American citizens, but they were fine with American soldiers still stationed there. They were fine with American soldiers refueling with Australian gasoline and restocking with Australian goods. They were fine with pre-approved American journalists taking pre-approved pictures while staying in Australian hotels. Because to them, this was all just a game, like checkers. The board was Antarctica. And so, in Callie's eyes, that would be boring. The real potential for ugliness would be in Australia, if and when the American military decided to punch their opponent in the face. And so I asked if I could join up. I asked the same government doctors who'd been praising the superiority of my new robotic limb for months. The same doctors who just agreed with my physical therapist that my coordination was probably improved after the surgery. Hell, not seconds before my inquiry, they'd just been going on and on about my arm's added strength and dexterity and durability and power and how Major League Sports had already banned any players who'd undergone replacement surgeries. Not that most Major League players could afford it, but that was besides the point, they said. And so, what did these government doctors say when I asked if I could join the U.S. Army and please be stationed in Australia or somewhere off the coast? You? Oh, no, son. We're really sorry, but you're disabled. If there's one thing I wish I would have learned from the government, it's this. Always have a backup plan. Government plans seem to flip-flop from the front to the rear, from plan A to plan B, all the time. For instance, when the government first set their sights on Grover, they planned to use robots and nuclear weapons. But they kept training human astronauts just in case. And when scientists said our current nuclear weapons still wouldn't work, the Defense Department didn't panic. They just shifted gears to Plan B, giant solar reflectors. Giant solar reflectors had already been in production for years. Basically, they worked by concentrating the sun's free, endless energy on Grover's surface until a point caught fire. Then, the evaporating material would act like a tiny rocket, propelling Grover off course. Giant solar reflectors became the new Plan A, but this didn't mean the government scrapped robots and nuclear weapons. Who knew when these tools might come back into the fray? Robots and nuclear weapons never vanished, though the government did reallocate a lot of their funding. In the same sense, when Zanadium made nuclear weapons a viable strategy again, the construction of giant solar reflectors continued, just lurking in the background. And after the Austral-Arctic War forced Osmond Keenan to return to America, he devoted all his time to perfecting giant solar reflector technology. In the process, working his way to the head of the government's Giant Solar Reflector, or GSF, department. I myself never did learn to formulate decent backup plans. No, I pretty much went with the first thing that occurred to me, and if that failed, then, and only then, I had to figure out something else. When I couldn't get into the military, I went back to the drawing board. The next viable option I came across, booking the closest flight destination available, which turned out to be South Africa. And then, to get the rest of the way to Australia, the first and only option I found was this: working on a cruise ship.